вечер. Гледате Клик Плюс, јас сум Боријан Јовановски. Вечера во Клик Плюс имам една ретка можност и задоволство да разговарам со двајца студенти кои доаѓаат од Харвард. Моментално се на докторски студии. Едниот од гостите има завршено на Харвард, а другиот е на докторски студии. И деновиве во Скопје се престојуваат околу 50 студенти од овие престижни универзитети во Соединетите Американски држави во организација и по покана на Отворен Балкан, односно на трите земји кои се веќе членки на оваа регионална иницијатива. Гости во студиото денеска во Клик Плюс се Хасина Бахадурзада. I hope I pronounce well your name. И Тале Локвенец, кој е наше момче. So, my very first question, especially for you, Hasina, you just came in Macedonia. So, what are your very first impressions?
I think the very first impression that we all shared was the welcoming. We were very much welcomed. We lost our luggage at the airport, but the way it was handled, it was very kindly. And when we got to the hotel, so I think the very first impression was the warm welcome that we received from people all over. And I think also from Talé, who welcomed us here in a very, where he actually emphasized that hospitality is something that is very central to the culture here. So it's been a very great first experience.
You grew up in, if I well understood, in Netherlands.
Correct.
So you know Europe. So what's the first impression when you arrive in Macedonia? That you came in Europe or elsewhere?
No, it has a very European vibe, and I think that the feeling I got is the vacations that I used to go with my parents. So it has a very, it has a lot of history. It's very rich. It's very old, the buildings, because I think I lived in Europe and I traveled in Europe. But then when you go to the US, as long as you're in Europe, you don't realize how rich it is and how much history and beauty there is. And I think with the pandemic and everything, I hadn't been back since 2018, late 2018.
In Europe?
In Europe.
But that's
Correct.
Your very first Balkan experience?
Very first Balkan experience, but coming back to North Macedonia feels coming back to Europe.
Talé, well, you are, I guess, the host. Nevertheless, you are part of the group, but you are somehow the host, and everybody, I guess, everything they have, you know, all the questions they have about Macedonia and the region they address to you. What are their, let's say, main concerns or questions, curiosities about Macedonia, the region?
So first of all, yeah, I'm one of the two co-hosts of the whole Balkan track, together with my friend Alexander, who has been an amazing co-host, and I want to give a huge shout out to him. Yeah, in regards to that, I feel that like the students had like amazing questions, obviously about like Macedonia's foreign policy, about the internal politics, and a lot of questions about how we are integrating the European values, what are our reforms in the media sector, the sector of law enforcement. But then they were also very curious. I think like people do not understand and appreciate how warm and like welcoming like the Balkans and Macedonia especially are to foreigners, because like we see a lot of general like violence towards foreigners in a lot of other countries that are way more developed. So to say economically and socially than Macedonia, so people had a lot of questions, which I thought were very interesting, because people just did not understand how safe it is, for example, to walk in the streets, and like how pleasant and welcoming everybody will be, and they'll greet you, as opposed to some countries where like you actually feel very unsafe going through some neighborhoods.
Any curiosities, surprises in a way, like, well, I've never seen that before.
So I think, I mean, like the people have been here very shortly, and like yesterday we had an amazing networking event where they didn't actually get to see a lot of the city. But I think everyone was very amused. That the general vibe was that like we're amazing hosts, we have very tasty food, and that like the people are very like surprisingly intrigued in like deep and interesting topics, and they do very cool stuff that is very relevant throughout the whole world. So that is the general vibe I was getting after the event last night and early this morning.
So let's explain a little bit for our viewers about this initiative. It's coming from Open Balkan.
So
There is no Open Balkan institutions, but however, I guess there are people in charge in the three countries coordinating the activities
Exactly.
of Open Balkans. So what's the idea of this tour, inviting the students from the
Of course.
prestigious university from
Yeah,
the States?
Yeah. So first of all, the idea stemmed from Alexander, as I already mentioned him, my co-host, who is a student at the Harvard Kennedy School. And the whole
he's
idea,
from Serbia.
He's from Serbia, yeah, he's from Belgrade. And the whole idea was to show this, like the history has shown us that Harvard and MIT are the universities that have produced some of the people that are leaders in this world. And like seeing the group that's here with us today, I'm very hopeful and I'm very enthusiastic to see how they grow, because I see some of the people that are like the future torchbearers in the world and people that are going to be in like decision-making positions on the world stage. So the whole idea was to basically show these people that like we have something to offer as Macedonians, as a country and as citizens of this country. And we wanted to show basically how we are developing economically, socially, our history, our culture, our cuisine. And in the meantime, like the main focus of this trip has actually been the youth, and we want to like showcase the young people who are interested in doing like very cool things in like different social spheres, from politics, non-governmental institutions to founders, journalists, etc.
Hesina, I guess you have some background information before coming here. So, what were your expectations before coming here, having in mind that background that you get during the preparation of this mission?
Preparation for the trip, or preparation of what I would find in the countries? In the countries?
If I may, just a short interruption, just to give some relevance. I think it's going to be very interesting because we did a short like prep talk at the Harvard Kennedy School where me, Alexander, and our friend Ori from Albania basically streamed a video that was very relevant to the EU integration of the three countries and the path we're taking towards there. And we gave some brief intro about the history and like the expectations for the country. So I think it will be very interesting if you draw
to share some of like the impressions that you get out of this background. And to compare with the reality that you face once here.
And I'm not going to say, I think we watched a documentary that gave us a little bit of the history, like what happened here, what happened in the Balkan countries, and I think there are some sensitivities that came to light, some beliefs about political, geographical regions, about how politics have developed. I think what surprised me the most in North Macedonia is it might be underlying sensitive, but people are much more open-minded than I expected to find. Like I wasn't sure what were topics that we could talk about, but so far I've not run into topics where I was like, oh, we shouldn't touch them or we can't talk about them. I've felt a lot of openness towards, even if this history is sensitive, people are willing to talk about it and explain their stand on things. So I was mostly pleasantly surprised by the openness with which political issues that are challenging and have been challenging are being discussed.
Like, for example?
For example, what kept North Macedonia from joining the EU? There's a lot of openness that's been towards us in discussing the issues that the country has had, or the economic situation. Like we had this conversation this morning, the unemployment rates, what the government aims to do, or the networking session last night was very interesting to hear from the young people what it is that their country is actually struggling with and how they try to address it. And that's very admirable, but also very vulnerable, and I think also something we can learn a lot from.
What's the perception? What's the perceptions of what are the perceptions of the, let's say, average American or someone who study on such a prestigious university, but something which is not related to the policy. You're making your PhD on healthcare management, which has nothing to do with geopolitics and this kind of things. But what are the perception of the Balkan and something full of history, conflictual relations during the history, even in the recent times? What are how you observe, how you see Balkans? I mean, without any prejudice, but just impressions.
I think the most prevalent reason why a lot of the students came on this track is because there is so little that people actually know from the region or about the region. Like, what did the people want? So I think, if anything, there is a general idea of these are the countries, but there is not a very in-depth understanding of what's going on and what's relevant for the people and why it's relevant. I think curiosity is what drove most of us here, and why we all decided to come on this trek, to understand, because it is an important part of Europe, what is going on and what people want. So I think, if anything, there's a lack of understanding of what's going on in the Balkan countries. Sometimes,
me personally, I have an impression that Americans feel Balkans like something separate of Europe. I mean, you can confirm or deny. I mean, that's my impression. You know, it's or you see Europe, and then there is a Balkan inside. You know, these geographic. You know.
I think there's always a joke for Americans that's like, there is the U.S. and the rest of the world. Yeah. You know, it's okay, you know, that's like.
No, we're not talking about America first. We are talking
no, not about that. But I think in general, it's like somewhere. Yeah. But I think there is, amongst the student at Harvard, I think there is, especially at the Harvard Kennedy School, I think there is genuine interest to understanding, because I don't think they're underestimating the influence or the significance of the Balkan countries, but I think they are not as educated on the Balkan countries. I think the history in the U.S., the way it's being taught, has not included, and I think for very legitimate reasons, because the history of how much has developed here in the past 30 years, or what has happened here in the past 30 years, is pretty recent. So the history is not as well known. But I do think people are a little bit more cognizant, and I think especially at the Kennedy School, where Europe does get more attention, and specific countries in Europe get more attention, there is definitely a lot of it's not seen as something separate. I wouldn't say something separate from the European Union maybe, but not from Europe.
Talе, maybe you can say something more, because you have this experience of being somebody from here. You have started your education in United Kingdom, then you have continued in United States. So, what's your feelings of how America understands Balkans?
I think I haven't been in contact enough with the general American public, but I think that at Harvard, I actually been positively surprised with the level of I would say general knowledge people have on history and geography, and how much you can have just a general conversation stemmed by their curiosity, where they know the basic stuff, but then they're very curious and they ask very relevant and specific questions, and where they're eager to learn more. And when I compare it to the UK, sometimes I would get some, I think it's pretty funny, I would get some questions where are you from? And I would say Macedonia. And then somebody would say, oh, Barcelona. And at that point, there is no point even explaining. I'm like, sure. Yeah. But in the US, I think people are way more intrigued, and they just have actual interest in learning about the region. So I've been very positively surprised by their general fundamental understanding and knowledge about the region, and then the questions that they're asking. And I think there is a lot of interest about the region, and people are very eager to learn, which actually shows by the number of people that are attending this track. Which was very a positive surprise for me as well.
Hasina, what's your understanding of why Macedonia and the other Balkans countries are not yet in EU?
So I think there are. So from my understanding, or from what we saw so far, is I think there are several criteria before joining the EU that, for example, in Serbia have not been met. in terms of how long the country needs to be stable. There are certain requirements for the countries that need to be done, and the conversations have not been ongoing for so long. Like even for the conversations to start, there are things that a country needs to go through, economically, socially, and politically, and that each country, for different reasons, it's been stalled. Like these conversations have been stalled, but that they're now at a point where there is actually, it seems within reach. It's been my understanding so far.
Talе, what's their understanding of
The general narrative.
why we are out?
The general narrative that me and Alexander and the rest of the organization team are trying to convey, and I think that's kind of the message that has been conveyed through most of the meetings, is that like the Balkans, in comparison to the US, has a very long and rich history, and a lot of nations and countries have crossed paths around here, which makes this history actually so rich, but yet so complex. And there is a lot of sensitive questions that stem from this rich history, which is all like a blessing in disguise, but then it also causes a lot of issues for these small countries. And I feel like as a region, we all need to, like, the message that we're trying to convey is that as a region, we need to like collectively overcome these issues and like build nice, like good relations between neighboring countries in order to be able for the whole region to be successful, and for countries such as Serbia, Macedonia, and Albania to proceed and join the European Union.
So, I guess, of course, when you ask now here why, what's our problem with you, then many people will start to explain that Bulgaria do not recognize our language, that they accuse us that we steal their history, you know. So it's not a policy, it's not about life, but it's about, you know, history, identity. Issue, a bit irrational kind of a thing. So how you understand that the countries in Europe still, you know, have a problem with such issues? Like language, we recognize, we do not recognize your history, your identity.
Oh, I think
this is kind of a mess.
I think, why this is keeping North Macedonia from joining?
Yeah.
I think the main idea behind these is that you want to avoid that there is too much tension, because joining the EU also requires certain stability, right? So these might feel irrational, but human confrontation, human discord is always irrational, right? There's no rational war, as I would think, but it is important to have peace in the region, because one country not being in peace with another country is a very different story from the European Union not being in peace. Because once you become part of a bigger whole, you also draw that whole, which would be then the European Union, you bring that conflict into a much bigger arena, right? So I think part of making sure that countries, what Talе also referred to, that countries are in a stable environment where there is peace amongst the neighboring countries, where there is no obvious contention or there's no obvious conflict going on, or in the recent times among the younger generation, right? That there is general peace, because otherwise it jeopardizes the European Union as well.
Talе, how do you explain this issue to your fellow Americans or students from elsewhere in Harvard?
I think it's a really hard topic, and like a topic that's like really close to heart as to like every other Macedonian. So I think it's like really difficult to talk about. But I think the main struggle and the main issue is that, like as we've seen in the recent years throughout the whole of Europe and also in the US, there have been a lot of like strong right-wing forces that are trying to like play to people's senses and their like feeling of like patriotism and nationalism, which is present within every person. And I feel one of the key factors for us as a country to overcome this is to like bring better educational system on the table, because I feel that like education is like one of the key distinguishers that makes people like understand better the broader picture and like what are the actual consequences of our harsh rhetorics at times, and then how we can actually be better at this like international I want to say, negotiations game and like handling international relations in a wiser way in order to like become like integrated with the European Union.
You came here from Serbia, from Belgrade. Serbia is nowadays in a very messy situation, protests, and after what happened, the tragedy that happened there. What were your impressions from Serbia in the situation there?
Is this one my impression personally?
Yeah.
I think the general premise is you walk away feeling just sad for people in the country, for the political situation. I think part of the situation was that we did not end up meeting with the officials because there were so many other pressing situations, pressing issues going on at the moment. So we didn't get the actual political view from Serbia as much as we were hoping to. That being said, as to what you just said, I think Tale's point about being tolerant and educating people. I think one of my friends we just came from a tour from the bazaar and the old bazaar, and he loved the fact that the mosque started calling for the prayer, and that he made a video of all the different flags hanging next to each other. That is a sign of tolerance and acceptance, and that we walked from a mosque to a church, that these things have been so close next to each other. I do believe that in just a feeling, because we didn't get much of a feeling in Serbia, but I feel like in North Macedonia, I feel that there is much more. I felt a very peaceful environment and very accepting from people, accepting one another, more diversity on the street, more calm, and people just enjoying daily life. And that comes back to your first question of, does it feel like Europe? Yes, it does. It feels like Europe, and it feels like a place where I would go out at night, walk on the streets, would be fine. Where I can ask for direction, people just politely direct me in the right direction. And I think those...
Well, I guess I have the same if I came in America somewhere. People will say to me the right direction.
In the good
parts.
parts.
Lie to me.
In the right parts of the U.S. In Cambridge, they will.
+1 on that one for sure.
Right. It's like there's a fun story. When I applied for my PhD, I was having an interview with one of the professors, and she asked me, she's like, how do you like the U.S.? And I said, I really love it. And she was like, yeah, because you've been at Stanford and Harvard. You've not been in the US. She's like, But jokes aside, I think it's not, having lived everywhere and traveled just throughout life, I don't think it's as, we can't take it as for granted as we sometimes do because we're in it. And I think maybe you've also had the fortune to be here and feel like this is how it should be, and this is how it is everywhere, but it is not. So I appreciated it very much when I came here and realized that it was.
As an intellectual, grew up in Europe, how do you see Europe nowadays? What's the perspective of this very success story from and after the Second World War, which looks like right now being in a serious crisis?
Yeah.
You grew up in Netherlands.
Yes.
Studied there, So what do you think about Europe? I'm asking you because I know that Euroscepticism is raising, and the criticism towards the European construction, as we know, it's also increasing,
I think the best thing for Euro-criticism is go abroad and live somewhere else and then look at Europe. Because I think, of course, Europe is not perfect, and there are things that are not right or things that are not to everyone's wishes. But still, it is a place where government really does what it's supposed to do. It takes care of all its population. It doesn't care. It cares about everyone. And I think when you create a society can only stand if every individual is not just by law part of the society, but feels part of a society because they feel seen, they feel taken care of. That social policy does have economic consequences, obviously, for a country, but also for something as a European Union. But it is what a government is, and I think it is for how it's supposed, when I grew up in Europe, always took it for granted, and we nagged about so many things in the Netherlands. But when I look back with the Harvard Kennedy School, if there is a country that is always given as an example, it's the Netherlands, and it's true. And I think, of course, there are issues.
And it's an example, I agree.
Yes, it's an example country, and it's a wonderful country, but I think Europe should also take pride in how they have taken care of their entire population and not just of the one that helped the government thrive better. And I think for everyone who's critical about the US, about the European system, just go live abroad for a few years. You will look at it with different eyes.
Having in mind your experience in both Europe and Americas, what you would say? You prefer to stay in Americas or to go back in Europe? I know it's a difficult question. Yeah, it's a very personal
question.
But yeah, I'm curious.
I think one of the I think living in the US made me an aware citizen. And that was mostly, it was one morning, it was a Saturday morning, and living in Cambridge, I got up and I was walking to meet a friend for breakfast. And I walked past him, and it was cold, and I was wearing like a very thick jacket, and there was a man sleeping on a bench. And I got chilled to the bone realizing that society is me and him. And we both agreed that I came out of a warm bed, and I'm wearing a thick jacket on my way to a breakfast, and he's lying there on a bench. And that society is not my society. I do not want to be part of that society. And I can make a change.
Which is not the case in Netherlands.
In the Netherlands, essentially, very less, and everyone who's homeless does not have to be homeless. Like, there is food, and there's a very basic living standard.
So, long story short, you prefer Europe?
Yes, but then comes the irrational part of human beings, because I moved to the US for family. So and intellectually, I enjoyed the US because there's a lot of, let's put it this way, I very much enjoy Harvard. It
was your choice, or you moved with family?
I moved for family, but then it was also, of course, my choice to move with family because I was a big girl when I moved. The intellectual challenge, the fact that you can have your voice heard, would make me for now stick to the US. But if anything, I would have loved to raise my children in Europe to show them, you know.
Well, yeah, that's a question, Talе, both of you. Then we have to finish. Unfortunately, it's interesting conversation. But Europe. But on the other hand, the best university still in United States. So what's Harvard? Why Harvard is so prestigious? I mean, you have an experience from Macedonia, well, not a good one. UK, where the education system, the higher education system is still good, Oxford and Cambridge. I mean. But then Harvard, you know. And for both of you, I mean, why Americans have such a strong education system? What makes this system such efficient?
I guess I can take this one for starters. So if I can describe Harvard in 2 words, like my whole experience at Harvard in 2 words, it would be eye-opening. Like, I was in the UK studying at the University of Warwick, where I graduated as the best student in my class in the engineering department. And I thought, which is like one of the top, 6, 7 universities in the UK, and it's one of the best 20 in Europe. And I thought that's an amazing university. I met a lot of like extremely smart people. But still, when I came to Harvard, one thing that I realized is that like these people are insanely smart, but it's also the work ethic. I think like the ethic.
What's the recipe of Harvard?
I think the recipe, like there is brilliant people, so you're surrounded with people who challenge you and your ideas and your views.
I understand, but then within the system.
Within the system, but then
which attracts so many people from all around the world.
Yeah, but it's kind of like a vicious cycle, right? Like when you have like the best minds go there, then also the best professors want to teach to the best minds, and then like these best minds keep coming back and back. And like I feel like one thing that Harvard really is good, and like all these like great universities in the US in general, is giving you the sense of belongingness. So once you're there, you're hooked to it. It gives you like a sense of belongingness, like you're part of this community and you always want to go back and you want to contribute. So no matter how much you grow in your life and in your career, you always remember Harvard and you're very grateful for like the ideas, for the for like how much Harvard allowed you to grow, and then people come back and they contribute back to Harvard. And I think that's one of the major strengths of like how the educational system is structured in the US, and it's one of the main strengths of Harvard.
Hasiina, we just spoke about Netherlands, which we agree it's a nice country, a society, taking care of people and taking care of education. Why Netherlands can't have a Harvard profile of university?
Because they don't understand PR the way the Harvard understands it, right? It's a lot of good marketing. It's, of course, there's brilliance, but there's also money. There is prestige, is also who do you attract? How do you sell the university to the world? That's like all those other sides of it. But then I think one thing that is really amazing about Harvard, and you already alluded to it with saying belongingness, it's the openness. It's the openness with which your ideas are perceived. You are never wrong. If you say something that someone else doesn't understand, it's because they don't know how you think. And they give you the room to think. And then if they can't follow your thinking, or if in your thinking your facts are wrong, they'll help you correct the facts. But that openness to new ideas, having the funds to support it, and letting young people lead with new ideas is, I think, a place where young people are attracted to, where they do not need to.
Very briefly to end this conversation, how do you leave the polarization in Americas? I mean, polarization is everywhere. I mean, we know there is a strong, polarization in our society in Macedonia. Yeah, but on the other hand, we see that there is a very, even sometimes dangerous situation generated by this ideological polarization in Americas. Talе?
I can take it briefly. I mean, my time in the US has been mostly at Harvard, and Harvard to begin with, but then also Cambridge and Massachusetts in general are known to be like fairly like united in their opinion. Like it's a very democratic and liberal.
In the Harvard campus, I guess you can't feel this kind of polarization, which you can find in the streets of I don't know.
I've had some like, I don't know, I've taken some like Uber rides or something like that, and then you get into like some general like, I don't know, daily conversations, small talk with the drivers, and you realize how much these ideas actually differ from being at the Harvard campus and talking to people at Harvard and MIT and like the usual events you go to, and then how heated, how quickly these conversations go. So you have to be like really cautious because you never exactly know who your speaker is, and you need to be very cautious in your wording in order to. Well, I've never had actually like a situation, but I've always been very cautious with how I phrase my wording, and I've been very curious to hear people's opinions, but like try to steer them in the direction very cautiously, just not to cause conflict. Because you never know. Especially like in my personal experience and like from what I've seen and read, I don't think I can like go like and like express my like fully open opinion on like this topic of diversity.
I think mine comes back to the very sociological perspective that society can only succeed when everyone feels part of it and everyone feels taken care of it. And inequality is high as ever been in the US. And it shows in the polarization. People are fed up. And I think people are right in their way of thinking. And I think it's very easy for us to talk about it because we'll be fine. Like we're not going to be the ones struggling, but people are seriously struggling. So the polarization comes from you have to understand where the anger in people come from. And if anything, we just need to learn to listen.
So, Hasiina, Talе, thank you very much for being my guest in our program, and I wish you a nice stay in Macedonia.
Thank you for having us here. It was a pleasure.
Почитувани гледачи, това беше се во издание на Клик Плюс. Ви благодаря за вниманието и до гледање.